What keeps these stories alive isn't proof, it's psychology. People don't just react to what they're told, they react to what they feel is being withheld. In the Epstein saga, the sense of incompleteness is baked in. He died before trial. His network was never fully exposed in court. Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted, but the trial focused narrowly on specific crimes rather than the broader web of associations. That gap between what people expected and what they received created a vacuum, and vacuums always get filled, sometimes with facts, sometimes with theories, and sometimes with narratives that feel true even when they aren't verified. When rumors place a well-known figure into that vacuum, the reaction intensifies. Meghan Markle isn't just a celebrity, she's a symbol. To supporters, she represents independence, modernity, and resistance to entrenched power. To critics, she represents ambition, manipulation, and image management taken to an extreme. Any allegation involving her instantly becomes more than a question of evidence. It becomes a proxy battle over identity, politics, and trust. That's why even unverified claims travel so far. People aren't sharing them because they've confirmed them, they're sharing them because the claims fit a story they already believe. The idea of a diary is especially potent because it feels intimate. Emails are transactional, legal, impersonal. A diary implies intent, memory, and personal truth. Whether such a diary exists or not, the concept alone triggers a sense of forbidden access. It suggests a private window into a hidden world, and humans are hardwired to want that access. Add in the suggestion of photographs, and the story gains another layer. Photos are culturally understood as harder to dismiss than words, even though context, timing, and authenticity matter enormously. Just the possibility of images is enough to raise the stakes. Then there's the question people keep circling back to: logistics. Not as evidence, but as narrative fuel. How do people move in elite circles? How do invitations happen? Who opens doors? These questions aren't new, and they aren't unique to this story. Hollywood, politics, and royalty all operate on networks most people never see. When someone rises quickly, observers often assume there must be hidden mechanisms at work. Sometimes there are, sometimes there aren't. But the assumption itself becomes part of the story, especially when reinforced by names, dates, and locations that sound plausible. Silence plays a critical role here, but it's also the most misunderstood element. Public figures stay silent for many reasons that have nothing to do with guilt. Legal strategy, risk management, and the simple reality that responding can amplify fringe claims all factor in. Yet silence is rarely interpreted neutrally online. It's read emotionally. For some, it's restraint. For others, it's confirmation. The same absence of response supports completely opposite conclusions depending on what the audience already believes. What's often missing from these conversations is proportionality. Verified facts and speculative connections are frequently placed side by side without clear boundaries. Over time, repetition erodes the distinction. A claim heard once feels dubious. Heard 10 times, it starts to feel familiar. Familiarity then masquerades as credibility. This is how narratives harden before evidence ever appears, and why later corrections, if they come at all, struggle to catch up. At this stage, the story exists less as an investigation and more as a reflection of collective mistrust. It says as much about the audience as it does about the people being discussed. Until concrete information is released, if it ever is, what's really unfolding is a test of how
Another reason these narratives gain traction is because they tap into a long-standing belief that powerful systems protect their own. Whether it's politics, royalty, finance, or entertainment, people have watched enough scandals fade without resolution to assume the same pattern will repeat. When Epstein's network wasn't fully exposed, that belief hardened. Maxwell's conviction answered one question but left dozens untouched. Who knew what, who went where, and who benefited all remain largely unresolved in the public mind. In that environment, any suggestion of hidden documentation feels plausible, not because it's proven, but because people already expect concealment. This expectation reshapes how every detail is interpreted. When someone points out that flight logs, private islands, and exclusive parties require access, it resonates with an audience that already believes access is currency. The logic isn't forensic, it's intuitive. It sounds reasonable, so it feels true. That's why storytellers emphasize timelines and social connections. They don't need to prove them conclusively, they only need them to feel coherent. Once coherence is established, the audience does the rest of the work, filling gaps with assumptions that align with their worldview. The discussion around photos follows the same pattern. Historically, photographs have ended careers and toppled reputations, so the mere idea that images might exist carries enormous weight. But photographs are also famously misleading without context. A moment frozen in time can suggest narratives that never actually happened. Despite that, culturally, we still treat photos as closer to truth than testimony. That bias is exploited, consciously or not, whenever a story leans heavily on the possibility of images rather than their existence. There's also a moral framing at play. The Epstein case isn't just about crime, it's about innocence, exploitation, and abuse of power. Once a name is even loosely associated with that ecosystem, the moral gravity pulls hard. People don't want nuance when children and abuse are part of the conversation. They want clear villains and clear victims. That desire can override caution, especially when the person in question has publicly positioned themselves as morally righteous or socially conscious. The fall feels more dramatic when the pedestal is higher. At the same time, counter-narratives exist, but rarely spread as effectively. Explaining legal standards, evidentiary thresholds, and the reasons silence can be strategic doesn't carry the same emotional punch as hinting at secrets and cover-ups. Calm explanations lose to dramatic implications in the attention economy. This imbalance means once a story like this gains momentum, it doesn't need new information to keep going. It feeds on interpretation alone. What's often overlooked is that unresolved stories don't end cleanly. They linger, mutate, and resurface in new forms. Each retelling adds confidence, not because new facts emerge, but because the audience becomes more familiar with the narrative shape. Over time, the question subtly shifts from, "Is this true?" to, "What if this turns out to be true?" That shift is crucial. It lowers the bar for belief and raises the emotional investment. Until something definitive happens, release of documents, authenticated images, or clear refutations, the story exists in a suspended state. In that suspension, it functions less as an accusation and more as a mirror reflecting public distrust in institutions and the people associated with them.
At the center of all this speculation is a simple but uncomfortable truth. Narratives gain power when official answers feel incomplete. When institutions close ranks, even for legitimate legal reasons, they unintentionally encourage alternative explanations to flourish. People don't need certainty to keep a story alive. They only need the belief that certainty is being denied. That belief becomes the engine that drives continued attention, discussion, and emotional investment long after the original events have passed. For figures living under constant public scrutiny, this creates a no-win scenario. Respond too aggressively and you amplify the story, inviting deeper investigation and wider audiences. Say nothing and silence is interpreted as calculation or fear. In that environment, every move is reframed through suspicion. Even ordinary career decisions, business launches, or public appearances become evidence to someone already convinced there is more beneath the surface. What ultimately determines how these stories end is not rumor, but documentation. History shows that speculation eventually collapses or crystallizes, depending on what is released into the public record. When credible documents emerge, narratives shift rapidly. When they do not, interest slowly burns itself out, replaced by the next unresolved controversy. Until that moment arrives, the story remains in a kind of limbo, sustained by repetition rather than proof. It's also worth remembering how often public judgment runs ahead of verification. In the digital age, people rarely wait for final answers. They form opinions early, defend them loudly, and then move on emotionally, even if later information contradicts their initial belief. Reputational damage doesn't require legal conclusions, only sustained doubt. That reality explains why allegations tied to emotionally charged crimes linger far longer than those tied to financial or political misconduct. For the audience watching this unfold, the deeper question isn't just about one individual, but about accountability itself. The Epstein case became a symbol of systemic failure, and symbols don't fade easily. Anyone connected, even tangentially, is pulled into that symbolic gravity. Fair or not, association alone is enough to trigger suspicion when trust in systems is already low. Until verifiable evidence is placed on the table, the responsible position remains uncomfortable patience. Skepticism toward power should coexist with skepticism toward unproven claims. Holding both at once is difficult, but necessary. Otherwise, narratives replace facts, and emotional certainty replaces truth. In the end, history doesn't remember rumors, it remembers records. Whatever eventually emerges, or doesn't, will decide how this chapter is written. Not rumor, not silence, but what can actually be shown. And until that moment arrives, viewers are left navigating uncertainty, balancing curiosity with caution, and deciding for themselves how much weight to give stories built on implication rather than confirmation. That tension, unresolved and persistent, is why this narrative continues to circulate, resurface, and provoke reaction, even as definitive answers remain out of reach. It persists because uncertainty feels more honest than false closure, and because unanswered questions, once embedded in culture, rarely disappear without undeniable evidence to finally replace them for everyone involved. The Epstein story never really ended. It just learned how to hide in plain sight. Every few months it resurfaces, not because someone suddenly discovered something new, but because the original questions were never answered in a way that felt honest. Files exist, then they don't. Names are referenced, then dismissed. Lists are rumored, then denied. Each contradiction chips away at public trust, and that's the environment where speculation thrives. Against that backdrop, a new wave of claims begins circulating, not as official announcements or verified documents, but as whispers moving faster than facts ever could. And when those whispers collide with a public figure whose image is built on control, precision, and narrative discipline, people lean in instinctively. They don't lean in because they know it's true, but because they know something doesn't add up. At the same time these rumors start bubbling, the public version of Meghan Markle looks serene. A new Netflix project, curated social media posts, a message of reinvention and calm California optimism. The contrast is almost cinematic. On one side, a carefully managed image of wellness and renewal. On the other, dark allegations emerging from the long shadow of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. This contrast is powerful because it forces the audience to hold two versions of reality at once. One is polished and visible. The other is messy, unverified, and unsettling. The human brain hates unresolved tension, so it starts searching for meaning in the gaps. What's being discussed in online circles isn't presented as a confirmed exposé, but as a pattern that people are trying to make sense of. The idea centers on alleged records from Maxwell's time in prison, supposedly more detailed than the leaked emails that were already confirmed to exist. Those email leaks are important because they establish a precedent. Guards were disciplined, investigations happened, and the system acknowledged something slipped out that wasn't supposed to. Once that door opens, even a crack, people assume more is behind it. That's where talk of diaries, notes, or personal records takes hold, whether justified or not. The name being repeated in these rumors isn't introduced casually. It's framed as shocking precisely because of who it is and what she represents. A woman who married into the British royal family, who speaks about social justice and protecting the vulnerable, being mentioned in the same breath as Epstein's island is jarring by design. The number 12 keeps coming up in these discussions, not because numbers prove anything on their own, but because repetition gives an illusion of specificity. Specificity feels like evidence, even when it isn't. That's why storytellers latch onto it. To be clear, none of this arrives with primary documents laid out for public inspection. There are no officially released pages, no authenticated photographs presented in court, no mainstream outlets publishing confirmations. And that's acknowledged repeatedly by those sharing the story. But acknowledgement doesn't stop momentum. In fact, it often fuels it. When people say, "This isn't verified," and then continue talking for hours, the disclaimer starts to feel like a formality rather than a warning. Silence from official spokespeople then becomes part of the story itself, interpreted not neutrally, but emotionally. This is how modern scandal narratives grow, not from one explosive revelation, but from the uneasy space between what's proven, what's denied, and what's never fully explained. That space is where imagination fills in the blanks, and once it does, it rarely retreats quietly.